Muchas gracias a la Fundación por la invitación. Jordi, creo que, enhorabuena a la Plataforma Editorial por editar este libro, porque realmente pues, va a ser un éxito. Lo está siendo, ¿no? Según me has contado, ya las ventas online son enormes. Voy a cambiar al inglés. I'm going to switch now to English. Wolfgang, it's a true pleasure to have this conversation with you. I've been an avid follower of your writings since you started Your Intelligence, when it was still for free for a few years, and then at the Elcano Institute I always said that it was worth the money, and so we've been subscribers of Your Intelligence since then, and I always enjoy your daily analysis, briefings. Sometimes I disagree, sometimes I agree, but they are usually very insightful, very useful, and I think over time you've become a true voice, a true important voice in the public debate in Europe around important matters like the European Union, world affairs, etc. So congratulations on your work, because it's inspiring, and it's great to have people like you.
Miguel, thank you for this introduction. Also, Jordi, thank you for this very kind statement. You're absolutely right. Spain managed to print first. Germany is the last, I'm afraid. This will not be published in Germany until July. And why that is, you may read in the book. This is something to do with the way Germany works these days. Everything takes a little longer. When I started the book, which isn't that long ago, like a year and a half ago, we didn't think that it would. I mean, there was an enthusiastic reception of the book in the UK, and there appears to be an enthusiastic reception to the book in Spain. I'm not sure there will be a similarly enthusiastic reception to the book in Germany, but it's going to be interesting. I've had friends with whom I used to work a long time ago, the publisher of a very large publishing company in Germany, former publisher, and she was, she said she read the book, and she introduced it to everybody in her circle, and so there is a chance that it's, at least in some segments it might catch on. When I wrote it, I thought there'd be like 50 people who read the book or something, and but I misjudged that, and thank you to the Foundation Rafael del Pino to invite me. That's a great honor. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, starting with the title, I think it's you cannot condense an argument better than in Kaput, right? I mean, everyone, you don't have to translate that, right? So that's already kind of a big...
It's one of the rare German words that are short.
Yes, that's true.
It's not like
not like Schadenfreude.
Not like Schadenfreude.
And there might be a bit of Schadenfreude around the world, in reading your book. But so let's have a conversation on Germany. Over time, I mean, I've been doing a lot of work on Germany. I've always been on the things are not that bad, and so we might have a nice back and forth in terms of and then I read your book these days, and I think it's an extraordinary book, and I think I agree with 85% of what your arguments are there. I guess there is then the question of whether this can be changed or not, whether it can be reversed, and so I thought we would start with economics, and then history. Let's start a bit with history, then economics, then if you want politics, and then Europe.
Sure.
If so it's a
good way
to approach this. So let me ask you the first question, which is, when did it all go wrong? No, which I think in a lot of interviews, a lot of people ask you this question, but I wanted to nail it a bit further down, because we don't want to go all the way. I mean, there's a whole history there of even the 1960s, 70s, etc. But Do you think it went all wrong, or it really started to go wrong with Merkel? That Merkel was the decisive figure? Because I think that's what a lot of people that are not as knowledgeable about, the history of all of this, they think, okay, the Merkel years were the ones that were wasted because she didn't really do all the reforms and investments that were needed. So did it all go wrong with Merkel or not?
No, I mean, I agree with the assessment that her chancellorship was a wasted 16 years, and she was in power for a very long time. And what you said was all correct, but it started actually earlier. It started in the period of Gerhard Schröder, who was a predecessor. And in fact, it started really with Helmut Kohl in the 1990s. So, I mean, I'm going back even further, but I think if you wanted to make, where things really changed was unification, German unification. Remember when unification happened, what did Germany do? It created a Treuhand, which was a sort of a state holding company for East Germany. Every asset in East Germany was introduced into the Treuhand. And the goal was to assure that the wage level in East Germany would rise to the West German level as quickly as possible, so that there wouldn't be competition. The West German companies, especially the trade unions, feared nothing more than competition from a low wage sector in Germany, and that was the primary motivator for doing it the way they did this. So what East Germany in the end got, and they were not particularly versed in market economy. They liked the Deutschmark, they liked the freedom, the West. The West had this sort of wonderful sort of image in Eastern Germany, and they didn't ask difficult questions at the time, like what would it do to the economy, what is the productivity outlook. And German unification has, by and large, I mean, it has been very expensive. The amount spent by the West, the transfers, they're still going on, the transfers to the East, and this is, by and large, I don't know what that volume was, and I'm getting a different figure, but it's certainly in the order of €1 trillion in terms of transfers from West to East Germany, considering that the economic growth is not particularly strong and the political divisions are very strong. I mean, if you look at the map, the political map of East Germany, if you do sort of like a UK-type constituency map, so who is the largest party in each of the constituencies, you would find that in West Germany it is the CDU, the party of the center-right, and in East Germany, it's the AfD, which is the party of the far right. These are the largest party. If you look at the parties of the left, the SPD has not a single majority in any constituency in Germany. That was the party of Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt. And Olaf Scholz, this party is completely squeezed. And the Greens have a few constituencies, mostly university towns, where they are relatively strong. So
what would you have done differently in terms of the unification?
What they needed to have done, I think they had basically what the Germans would call Anschluss. They had constitutionally they could have done it in two different ways. They could have gotten East Germany in by East Germany adopting the West German constitution, that's what they did, or they could have negotiated a new constitutions between them. And East Germany was and everybody wanted it to happen so quickly, they didn't go for any negotiations. So East Germany was gobbled up, and the Treuhand system, it was, I think it was pure evil. The ultimate way, the way it was done, because it essentially destroyed an economy. There was no way the East Germany could match West German productivity levels. These productivity levels grow over a long period of time. Sure. As they have done in Spain. Imagine you had forced the current system on Spain 40 years ago. It would have, the economy would have been crippled if you had forced the current wage level, the current social security system, all the things that we have acquired over a long period of time, to a newcomer. And that's essentially what East Germany did. Or what West Germany did with East Germany. The rest of Eastern Europe had a much more benign development. The first years were tough for Poland and the Czech Republic. It took a long time, but they are doing really well now over a long period of time because they managed to adjust. In the beginning, their advantage was cost. They had a lower cost production, but that's not the case anymore. They kind of, their wages increased close towards the Western levels. Their productivity increased along with the wages. Whereas in East Germany, that wasn't the case. They had high wages but still low productivity, and that produced a significant recession. I don't want to talk too much about German unification, but that basically was sort of the beginning of sort of a corporatist planned economy-style experiment where the West basically exerted its will on an entire region. Under Gerhard Schröder, he introduced reforms, and these reforms were lauded everywhere, including in Spain. People thought these were great reforms. But what these reforms did was Germany had a system.
Not so much on the left.
Yeah,
here in the left,
I guess,
were critical,
but for different reasons. Then my criticism of the reforms were that they cemented Germany's specialization of industrial production. They cemented Germany's export system based on export surpluses, and it made Germany temporarily more competitive. There were a number of other things that happened that were kind of coincidences. There was a supply chain revolution in manufacturing starting in the 1990s. Companies optimized their global supply chains.
The container comes in.
Yeah, the container and just-in-time production. That was a big thing. It made German companies significantly more productive. The big one was East European enlargement. 2004, we had 10 new members. Germany was one of the first to exploit that through investing into intermediate goods. So parts of the supply chain was outsourced to Eastern Germany, to Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. And
China started to grow.
And China started to grow, and China was initially complementary with Germany. So China produced consumer goods, but needed capital goods in order to produce those consumer goods. And Germany supplied China with the capital goods, whereas China produced the consumer goods. And Germany and China were kind of a happy couple. They were both sort of export dependents, but in sort of complementary sectors. They were not going against each other. And the other thing was the Eurozone crisis, because that gave Germany a 15% devaluation against the rest of the world, real devaluation, because the devaluation of the euro did not come with higher inflation. In fact, inflation was very low. So in real terms, the German competitiveness in that period was very, very positive. And my criticism at the time looked increasingly wrong. It looked like what I said was wrong. Germany was strong, and in the period of the year 2005, the first 10 years of the Merkel administration, Germany looked very strong. And it's only now in the last period, the previous 10 years, that people started to realize things were not that great.
And that's why it goes wrong. And you explain in your book, right, that this is a country that in many ways, because of its cooperativist system, if you look at it from varieties of capitalism literature, there is this kind of connection between the industry, the banks, the politics, in heavy industries, in the old 20th century industries that do very well, right? Chemistry and vehicles and all sorts of heavy industries was, and made in Germany and all of it. But somehow, as you explained very well, this is a country that struggles to go from analog to the digital world.
Yes, that's right. And I think there's an interesting thing. The Germany I grew up in was very innovative. Everyone, when they went to university, they studied, maths or physics or sciences. This was the thing that most people did. And, people had, in my family, everybody held technical discussions about, certain measurements and stuff like this. It was a very technical, engineering-focused society. And, back in the 70s, Germany was very much, that was the cutting edge of the technology. Digital was not yet, it was starting to be developed in the United States, but it didn't hit the big time yet. It was sort of interesting for defense, but it didn't have yet the big consumer. PC hadn't been invented, and all the other stuff, the internet hadn't been invented. And Germany has systemically underestimated that technology. And that was partly because it was not a German technology, the first of the big technologies in which Germany was not a leading player. German scientists were a big part of the quantum physics revolution, but in the Second World War or before, most of the scientists, Jewish scientists, left Germany. In fact, they actually left. They weren't killed. Most of the physicists, they left early. And they got to American universities that took part in the Manhattan Project. If you continue from there, from 1945, it's 2 years later they invented the transistor. Another 10 years they invented the integrated circuit. So things took off in America, and eventually, they laid the foundation for the internet, for the PC in the 1980s, the internet in the 1990s. And I remember reading a book by an MIT professor in the 90s, when I was in the United States, about how digital lives were to change our world. And he criticized Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand's push towards analog high-definition television. That was a big deal in the late 80s, early 90s. That was the big prestige project. It was an analog television standard, but of high definition. Kohl thought it would be, Kohl was very short-termist, so he wanted, what I call sort of finite political gratification and finite political time. He wanted the technology, unveiled while he was still in office. And, it didn't happen because they miscalculated the cost. And the problem with analog technologies in television was that every country in Europe had different standards. You remember PAL and SECAM and all these different standards, and there were within those standards differences in the number of lines per. This was analog technologies was a pretty complicated technology, and the Germans have as a society underestimated digital. And here comes another thing.
The crisis, the dot-com crisis.
Well, the dot-com crisis was a factor, and they were temporarily enthusiastic about it, but they lost out. I mean, the dot-com crisis was worse in Germany than in others. There was the Neuer Markt. This was a sort of a penny stock market, and it was crazy. I mean, it had sort of 1929 type exuberance characteristics, and I think the market fell by.
Or even the tulip, right? The
tulip
mania type. Do you say that the drop similar to the tulip mania?
It was 95%. Now that wasn't the case in the United States. I mean, they had a dot-com bubble, but nothing like this. And anyway, in the United States, the dot-com bubble, the bursting of the dot-com bubble, wasn't the end of dot-com. In fact, it was the beginning of dot-com. Whereas in Germany, it was the end of dot-com, and it was too much of a shock. And I think the Germans have sort of realized at the time is, okay, we have this analog technologies, we're very good, we're making a lot of money with this. The electric car was not on anybody's radar screen. Sure. So they felt that, digital technology is all fine, it's like movies and it's entertainment. And we're not good at entertainment anyway, we're good at, heavy earth-moving equipment. And so let's just do what we're good at, and we do industry, and we want to become competitive.
Do you think, because there's a thing that, when I was reading it, and I think you don't touch too much on the book in this, that there's an element as well of seeing the digital world that is prone for surveillance, that you have this obsession in Germany about privacy, and that people thought that digital emails, internet, all of that, in a way, was encroaching on their privacy. So they always tried to be less on it, to be distant from it, and that this was as well kind of a cultural issue that is still in many ways hindering Germany to progress on it, because privacy for them, people always say here that back in the days we had the telephone guide, and we had the numbers of people, the addresses and everything, right? I mean, back in the days, the telephone guide, we had the addresses and the phones of people, right? Now you would never really have the address of someone's, right? And so for them moving, there's kind of contradictions there, but on the other hand, I think that they were afraid that they could be surveyed.
Yeah, it was a technology they did not invent. And I think that's something I learned about Germany, that they were very comfortable with technologies that they invented or co-invented, like when they invented the car and lots of chemical processes, and they understood them at a very deep level. But the digital technology was something that they were generally not conversant with. And some of the car companies put digital stuff into their cars, and they became gradually easy. But the culture of Germany was anti-digital, as you mentioned. The EU's digital legislation, GDPR, the AI regulation more recently, the crypto market regulation, is hostile to the industry. It fears intrusion into privacy. And this, Ursula von der Leyen is German. She is a Commission president, elected by a majority that is the EPP, of which the largest party is a German party, and the one that's most likely to come into power this time. And
let me push a bit there on this front. Susanna Zuboff and others in surveillance capitalism, I mean, they've done work showing that, the amount of data that we give to all these companies and how much they know about our lives, and that, that our youngsters and that people might spend too much time on these platforms, and that they somehow, we saw what happened as well with certain elections and Cambridge Analytica. That some kind of cautiousness, some precautions are due, because at the end of the day, they might be too powerful, these platforms, and they have negative effects in our societies.
Well, most things in life and politics would suggest some balance. The AI industry exists in the United States and China, to a small extent in the UK, but not in the EU. There may be some small exceptions, but mostly we are not, because we are focused on data protection and not on data business. That is
or data sharing.
Yeah, we are very bad at this. The AI, the electric automatic car, will not happen in the EU. The EU will be one of the last places on earth to introduce the self-driving car, because we will see problems, whereas others see opportunities. So I think there is a balance between protection and opportunity, and the EU legislation, and this has also been emphasized by European courts, is 100% emphasizing protection. The courts, in a recent ruling, said that is the ultimate guiding principle of their attitudes, because that's what the legislation says. The legislation puts the consumer first. That's not the case elsewhere. And I think that is a mistake, and very much influenced by Germany. I think other European countries didn't push back against this, but Germany was very much.
So you don't believe in the third way, the European way of human-centered?
No, it's not the third way.
Digital.
I don't think it's the third way. It really is the opposite way. A third way would actually be fine to have. A third way would be one where you accept the need for business, for digital business, and you introduce some safeguards. And the safeguards you introduce, you want to make sure that they are effective rather than bureaucratic, because you kill the industry by regulating them to death. Nobody in their right mind would open an AI company in the EU. It is you will not succeed. You would do this if you want to be in this shore. You'd be in the UK or maybe in Dubai, places where electricity is cheap, where you can leverage things, where nobody bothers you. That's where you would. There's an interesting example about the culture. There is an author in Germany, a guy called, I forget his name, Spitzer, Manfred Spitzer. And he, a best-selling author, and he has written books about how people become stupid because of digital technologies. He
ran mobile phones, especially.
I'm also not in favor of having kids having mobile phones, and certainly not having kids having mobile phones in schools. And that is a mistake. But this is not what this was about. He felt that all things digital, should be kept off the curriculum. And he felt that when he was asked, but isn't this something people need to know, like computer programming, and we're talking about this stuff, not TikTok. And he said, we're not teaching our kids we don't teach our kids about drugs. Why should we teach them about digital? And that was kind of the attitude. It was like an evil influence from the outside. And, that was a best-selling book. A lot of people believe this. I have family members who cite the book at me and saying, this is what the guy was right. And this is sort of an attitude in Germany. And this attitude has prevailed in all walks of society. Like in the car industry. Where the Germans have famously not seen the trend. They have doubled down on diesel. They doubled down on the technologies that there was a famous statement by the former head of Volkswagen, Ferdinand Piech, who was part of the Porsche family, is that there is no space for electric cars in my garage. Now that guy has a very large garage because Volkswagen doesn't only own VW, as you know, it owns Seat, but it also what he had in his garage was Maserati and Bentley and a lot of nice Porsches naturally because that is part of the Porsche family. So he had a lot of cars in his garage, but he would not have an electric cars because electric cars for the German car industry was very much a male macho. They were engineers, they were technologists. I feel the same everything I rent a German car. I had the pleasure the other day, I rented a German car for 2 days. It took me 10 minutes to figure out where the volume was on the radio. I could not see it. And I eventually figured out they had a place where nobody ever puts it, the volume button. You would assume it's somewhere near the radio, but it wasn't near the radio. It was like almost a meter away from the radio, but you have to kind of remember that. Or look up in a manual. And then I couldn't figure out, and then there was it was an automatic car, which are normally very easy to drive. I mean, you just go from P to R to D. I mean, there's not much choices you have to make. But the way they did this, they implement this, I always got confused. I always pushed in the wrong direction. And that is something, where, I was speaking to a chauffeur, not a chauffeur, but an owner of a company of luxury taxis. An airport service, and I asked him, did he have electric cars? And he said, I tried. The German cars were too complicated. And that's something...
But Germany is the second biggest producer of electric cars in the world, right? I mean, they are exporting quite a bit of cars and producing cars, electric cars. I mean, it seems that they are starting to be in the game, even in the electric car business.
They are not. They're making money on this, and they entered the wrong segment of the market. The German electric cars are widely the market for electric cars at the moment is in cheap cars. And they will eventually do this. VW has a plan next year to introduce a 20,000 or 25,000 car, and obviously they will make a lot of cuts. But the problem with the Chinese is they are further ahead in digital technology, and they are certainly ahead in battery technology. So the problem for the Germans is not just that they are more expensive. It's not a competitiveness problem, primarily it's an innovation problem, that the Chinese are ahead of them in the innovation cycle. And that's something that they never experienced before. And it's something also, and as I gave you my little story about the complication of the cars. If you experience a Tesla, for example, a Tesla is an iPad, essentially. You go into a Tesla, there's sort of an iPad-style device. It's not an iPad, but something like an iPad. And everything is very intuitive. Temperature of the car, all the stuff you need is clearly, immediately and intuitively available. There are no complications, there are no buttons in the car. It's just this one thing, whereas the German cars are full of buttons. So I think they misjudge the notion of a digital world, because this is a digital device. This is not a car anymore. It's a digital device that drives. But at its heart, I mean, the Volkswagen, when they were in China and tried to compete with they've been, you're right, they have produced electric cars. And the reason they're the second largest is because the Japanese, who the other big car company, and the Koreans,
they're doing even worse.
They're not doing great either. The Japanese have specialized on hybrids. That was sort of their technology. Interestingly, also invented by the Germans, but the Germans didn't like it, so they sold it off to the Japanese. And so the Japanese had seen no reason to rush into electric cars, but so the Germans are the second largest producer of electric cars in the world, because that's the size. And their car industry is just so huge, and they do, but they're not doing well. They're not making money.
Okay.
And I think that's the essential thing. And when you look at the self-driving car, that's a software product. It requires a lot of data collection. Yeah. Do you see self-driving cars driving through the streets of Madrid or Munich or Berlin, collecting data? No, it's not happening. But it's happening in Wuhan and Beijing.
I think we Europeans, in that sense, we would like to see the Americans doing first and then see how it goes.
Yeah, but it will be, it will not be our technology. And the money, that's right. That's what we will do. We will wait until they they collect the data, and there will be accidents when they do this, because it's a learning, machine learning, and obviously they don't start having learned, they learn as they do this.
Let's move on to other sectors that I wanted to touch upon on the economic side. Energy. Was it a mistake to cut off nuclear energy?
Of course.
And was it a bigger mistake to be so reliant on Russian gas, cheap Russian gas? And what should have been done differently?
Every party in Germany supported the Russian gas connection. Every single party, except for excuse me, except for the Green Party. So this was a broad national consensus. There was like they had this expression Wandel durch Handel, which rhymes and it means change through trade. And they had the view that they can change Russia through trading. Obviously, that didn't happen. So it was a national misjudgment. But it wasn't just somebody's misjudgment. It isn't like an opposition party was mostly against it or another. It was everybody misjudged. All industry, all the unions, everybody in Germany. There wasn't much discussion. I mean, I remember all the columnists there said, of course we have the Russian gas because we need it. That was sort of the end of the discussion. So it was a mistake because.
But why do you think that they didn't diversify? Why do you think that they didn't think, okay, yes, we want cheap Russian gas, but if something happens, let's have, like Spain, have 7 stations where you have liquefied gas, and I don't know, have a plan B.
This happened under Schröder. When he came to power, he was in a coalition with the Greens. And the only thing the Greens wanted, the Greens were very compliant partners, but for the Greens in the early 2000s, what they really, really badly wanted is to get out of nuclear. It was a party that was
based on that.
Based on that. It's the philosophy of the party. Sure. And it wasn't CO2 that gets the Greens, it's nuclear. That was the bigger issue for them. And both Schröder and later Merkel agreed that nuclear needed to be phased out, and Merkel accelerated. I mean, the Greens and the SPD in the early 2000s agreed a phase-out plan that would have kept the nuclear industry in place until 2030. And when the Fukushima accident happened in Japan, Merkel accelerated the entire schedule so that the last power station would come offline in 22. And that was the big decision. So having decided that for political reasons, they had no other choices. I mean, it was too early for renewables in those years. Renewables were not yet in a position to take up that volume of electricity consumption. Coal was still going strong. So the only other thing, if they ever wanted to meet their CO2 targets, they needed gas. Gas was the cleanest of the fossil fuels in terms of in terms of emissions from power stations, especially the newer generation of power stations. With coal, there wasn't much. There isn't much hope. You can't do. You're not gonna catch the thing. And the Greens have. They were in power and instituted the exit in 2023. Actually, it was extended for a short period, and then they got out. And for them, it was essential. And Putin had already invaded Ukraine, so we already had an increase in gas prices. So this was not, a failure to seize geopolitics. They saw the geopolitics very clearly, but that was more important to them.
Merkel concluded that Merkel did the final decision to.
Yeah, Merkel was interestingly, even though the only thing she did in the end was geopolitics, she misjudged geopolitics. She misjudged Putin, she misjudged China, she certainly misjudged Trump. That was something, that was a politician with whom she could not deal with, because he was the only one who didn't believed that trade was a mutual beneficial game, which is a bit rich coming from Germans because they always run a trade surplus against you. So when Germany says it's mutually beneficial, they meant it usually benefited them, and it certainly benefited Germany. Not really for an economy. I think there is an interesting economic part of the story, which I always thought if I wanted to tell the story in a shorter, I mean, we had energy, we had geopolitics, we had reforms, we had social and cultural factors. But the unifying factor behind all of this is an economic model that, like the Chinese model, depended on industrial export surpluses. Now, this is not industrial exports. There's nothing wrong with industrial exports. I'm not against industry. I'm not against exports. These were surpluses.
Huge, more than 8%.
It was 8% at one point, over 8% at one point. Now, what is a surplus? And a trade surplus is the same as a savings surplus, in exactly the same amount. Now, what does it mean? Germany saves more. It's not households. Households always save, but it's the economy as a whole. It's the government and the private sector. They were net savers. They did not invest in Germany, and they did not consume in Germany. China has the same problem. China represses consumption. And it runs very large trade surpluses or saving surpluses against the rest of the world, and they both depend on the United States and other countries. The UK was one of them, Australia is one of them, but the United States is the big one, to absorb the saving surplus, because these surpluses globally need to add up to zero. So you can't run this policy if there isn't a counterparty. And the whole globalization period was a Faustian pact, where the surplus country had a deal with the deficit country. Because for the deficit country, it was great. They could run deficits. They could consume things they couldn't produce.
The United States, United Kingdom.
It was fun. The deficit was easily funded because the surplus countries, generated dollars, and they needed to invest their dollars. So they invested in the United States. And this sort of, I think it's a bit of a Ponzi game, sort of a geopolitical Ponzi game. It assumed that the assumption was that someone like Trump would never go to power, let alone twice. That somebody, that an American president would never question Biden didn't question that, and Obama didn't question that, and Harris didn't question that, but Trump did. And not all Republicans would have questioned that either. Trump is very unique among Republicans to question the trade deficits. And my reading of the situation is that this is different. His administration now is different from the one in 2017. He is much more serious and much more focused on trade. And if he eradicates those, I mean, it's generally, if you study international economics, they always say to you, don't focus on bilateral trade balance, focus on multilateral trade balance. Trump doesn't work like that. Trump is a transactional guy. So he says, okay, Germany has a trade balance of trade surplus of 70 billion, the EU has a trade surplus of 230 billion, China has a trade surplus of 300 billion, Canada, Mexico, also a very large trade surplus. I think the whole deficit the US has against the rest of the world is close to 1 trillion. Now, I don't think Trump will close the 1 trillion, but he can cut down by a very significant amount through trade policies. Now, that may have all sorts of negative economic effects.
For Germany in particular, if tariffs are implemented. So let's move, because, I want to go into the politics side also, but I think the key that you just mentioned, I think, is Germany has all these savings. A lot of these savings were invested in the United States, and you have this quote, you're right, I mean, this guy's from Düsseldorf, I think it was, that buy all this toxic financial products that we create and led to the global financial crisis. But you as well kind of saying, I think this is not only valid for Germany, because Enrico Letta in his report as well, we have all these savings, but we are not able to channel them into venture capitalism, into entrepreneurs, into innovation, and so that's particularly the case in Germany, because, as I said, the model of Germany was industry, unions, if you want, right? Banks, mostly banks, and the government, politics. So how do we break this? I mean, how I know that you are a big fan of this leads us as well, if you want, to Europe, right? The European, I mean, Mario Draghi comes and says we need 800,000 or 800 billion euros per year. We need to channel this somehow. Both public and private investment. I know that you're fond of a capital markets union, that we need a capital markets union, but this is given German capitalism, given European capitalism, and given that a lot of entrepreneurs, in Germany, in Spain, etc., they don't want, they want to take debt. They don't want to, give out shares, right? Because they think that this is their little product, etc. So how do you break this? How do we make sure that we get the financing we need to get more competitive? And is lifting the debt brake in Germany a first step?
I think the debt brake is a first step. I think it needs to happen. I also believe it will happen.
But that would be great news.
If you do the maths on the German fiscal side, I mean, it's about 3 to 6% of GDP that is unaccounted for. If Germany did what the political parties have committed to, Germany would have a deficit the size of France. It would not have a zero deficit. And it's basically nobody knows how to fund this. And the right says, okay, let's cut social security. So let's introduce soup kitchens. That's what it would mean, because we're talking, social security budget is about 100 billion, and they need between 120 and 240 billion. So you just look at the order of magnitude. If you didn't do this through savings, through lending, you would have to abolish the welfare state. I mean, all aspects of it. I mean, it would be vouchers for soup kitchens, not even soup kitchens. I mean, you would really change this. And nobody is proposing that. But what I'm saying is, if Merz wants to cut the taxes for corporations, if he wants to, get the NATO defense spending target from 1.3% of GDP to 2% of GDP, if he does all these things, the climate change fund, there are an awful lot of investments that have to happen. They need funding. Now, frankly, the public sector is not going to stem this. This is not going to happen. The public sector in Europe doesn't have the money. The only way to do this, especially on areas like climate change, on areas to do with technology, high tech, you need private sector funding. And the only way to do this, the banks can't do this. The banks are not made to do this. German banks, a Sparkasse, is not a venture capitalist. They fund, retail stores. That's what they give a loan to. And they have collateral, the value of the store, or some kind of shares or bonds that the owner of the store, deposits at the Sparkasse. The German system is not generating funding for new companies. I see no alternative to a capital markets union, and Germany is the one that blocks it, because Germany doesn't want to give up. I mean, the banking union is not working in Europe. Well, it's working only for a few small banks, but not for large banks. But it's not working for small banks, and Germany doesn't want this. I mean, Helmut Kohl got himself an exception for the Landesbanken. All the Sparkassen are off the European grid. I mean, you don't know what's going on there. There's actually a financial risk building up as German industry declines. It's the state-owned banks that fund those industries. Now, we haven't heard anything about this, but if you had a decline of industry, and there would be a financial risk building up in sections of the German financial sector. That's the kind of stuff that would happen. So I think eventually there will be some big financial crisis, and then people may hopefully one day may see that they need a real capital markets union. It's the only way. If we get to Mario's 800 billion figure, and whether the number is right is debatable. But this cannot be done by the public sector. The idea that
alone, not of course.
No, I mean the public sector. The public sector is not suited. I don't want Ursula von der Leyen. Invest in AI. She doesn't know what it is. What I want her to do is to rethink the regulation. The Commission. They shouldn't be talking about programs. They shouldn't be talking about money. They should be saying, okay, maybe our regulation wasn't that great. Maybe we should talk about regulation. Maybe we should talk about a capital markets union. They downgraded the project, the capital markets union, to what they call a savings and investment union.
Well, I think they want to give it another name so that to see whether this is going to be working.
Yeah, the idea is to. This is a one of these European things. I mean, we all remember these. The Europeans have a lot of programs of big names and often not much. Remember Jean-Claude Juncker's 300 billion investment program. There was, it didn't. I don't think it generated any money at all. It was just reclassification of investment that was happening in Spain and Germany, and he kind of claimed ownership of it, and it was suddenly, his program. We're doing a lot of that in Europe. The Inflation Reduction Act by Joe Biden, that was real money. The Europeans were shocked because they don't do real money. They only do, marketing and fluff and, salesmanship. And, Joe Biden gave real money to companies. So the capital markets union is essential. And it needs to be, it can't be run by the same old banks. But, Germany, to some extent France, need to accept that they will lose their hold. Italy is pretty bad as well. That they will need to lose the hold on the banks. But 10 years ago, I was invited to a party by the FDP, the party, the libertarian party in Germany. They're all sort of, rich and wealthy, and they're all. And they had most radical ideas about how to deregulate the economy. And then I talked about the banks. I said, would you be okay if Deutsche Bank was bought by an Italian bank or a Spanish bank? And they said, of course not. No, I mean, that was basically the hypocrisy of free marketism. Is the banks needed to be owned, because the way this works is the politicians sit in the supervisory boards of the Landesbanken. And they also sit in the supervisory board of steel companies. And then they get the steel companies and the Landesbanken to finance the steel companies.
But that's German. That's German. The variety of German capitalism that is known as stakeholder capitalism,
yes.
right? That was successful for a long while.
Yeah, it was. I'm not denying that it was successful. And in the 21st century economy, it doesn't work anymore, because the kind of companies that you can't fund, Amazon with this type of model, or Apple, or Google, or whatever the next generation of AI is. This isn't going to be a government-sponsored institution. It's not going to work like that. I'm not saying we should do what the Americans are doing. That's not what I'm saying at all. But the private sector, the huge amounts. Even the Chinese, the way the Chinese did this, they actually had a kind of a venture capital idea. They threw a lot of money into the car sector, for example. And it was like, do or die. Most of these companies died, but a few succeeded, and actually quite a few succeeded. And it was pretty much a market-driven process. The best succeeded, and are now in the world. The Chinese are not, are not Western capitalists, and never will be, but they used the market mechanisms to actually achieve success in this area. And I think we should do this too. This has nothing to do with our model. We can still have, collaborative share stakeholder, control of companies. I don't think that is affected by this at all. But it would probably have to be modernized. I mean, the German thing of works councils, of joint representation, supervisory boards, has become very stiff and inflexible. And the big debates in Germany is should ThyssenKrupp cut steel capacity. They don't talk about AI. Nobody talks about AI.
Well, I think the debate between the two, Olaf Scholz and Friedrich Merz, was quite disappointing in terms of no vision.
No.
And very likely Große Koalition GroKo again.
Probably.
And I think you are quite pessimistic in terms of that the new government, whatever the colors,
if you do the
will
math,
not do... Yeah. I mean, my worry, Wolfgang, is that's my analysis, that if Germany does a bit what Friedrich Merz, who's the likely next chancellor, proposes, is that, and we are seeing that already in many ways, the German industry has become more efficient. They, in terms of, industrial output, it's less, but if you look at added value, has not declined as much. So there will be some sort of supply reforms, lowering perhaps taxes if possible. There will be cutting a bit of social welfare. So that we might end up a bit like the Schröder times. So Germany will become more efficient in what it is still doing, but it will not really do the radical things that perhaps Germany needs to become more competitive. And the problem is that it will not believe in a European industrial policy a la Mario Draghi. Oh, no. And therefore, we will still not have a federal, centralized fiscal capacity able, because that's where you and I think, agree that we need some sort of, central fiscal capacity, although small, but we need that. We need Eurobonds, essentially, to be able to compete with the United States and Europe, to provide for the public goods that are necessary to be in the big game.
Absolutely.
And so that's my big worry.
Yeah, we need both, a fiscal union and a capital markets union. They complement each other. And Merz is not interested in a fiscal union. He will also not be very happy with any European defense funds and all the stuff that people will be talking about with Ukraine, and so Germany will be in a very difficult position. The IMF, when they project economic growth, they have in their tables they have a 5-year ahead forecast. Now, 5-year ahead is not a pinpoint forecast of what happens in 2030. It is basically what they think is the structural average growth. And for Italy, they have 0.7%. And for Germany, they have 0.7%. And I think that's about right. And I think that would be consistent with your scenario. Yes, there will be some confidence coming back. There will be a functioning government. The last government was not functioning, so this will be a functioning government. There will be some reforms. The SPD will agree to probably tone down the citizens' income. Merz will probably tone down his tax cut proposals. There will be some, but they will not be the ones in the size. They will probably foot drag on defense, as everyone else in Europe will, because they don't have the money. The smartest thing they can do on defense actually is not to spend more, but to make it more efficient. I mean, we can get twice the efficiency in defense if we Europeanized it. This is the last big efficiency gain in Europe. If we, instead of having, I'm not a defense.
But I think Merz, in a way, said that he...
No, he does. He does have that. But he's not going to get this because it means we have one battle tank in Europe. We have one fighter aircraft. And, at the moment we have, I don't know how many competing systems. But it would mean that several countries, and Germany included, would have to give up what they're doing now and move to a centralized systems and joint procurement to achieve those efficiency gains. The experience has shown, I mean, the EU does sort of small-scale stuff. And the experience in the small-scale stuff has been that you double the efficiency. Oh, it's really quite hard. I mean, the single market never did anything like this. There are not many areas in life where you can double your productivity. And this is a big one. So you can basically get if you have 1.5% of defense to GDP in Spain, I think you probably even less than that.
Yep.
I mean, if you double the efficiency, that's the same as spending 2.5 or 3% on defense. So I think if it is about defense now, for Trump it's not about that. For Trump it's about buying American equipment. So he doesn't want the Europeans to seek efficiency gains and have a European solution to this. That's absolutely not what he's interested in. Of course not. He likes to divide everybody and gets us to buy. And some Europeans will do this. And they're only it's not just Viktor Orban. He's got enough Europeans who are trying to cut deals with him. That's gonna. You see this Italy. Meloni's already cutting deals with Elon Musk. Orban will cut deals and he will do whatever Trump tells him to do. The new Austrian Chancellor, Herbert Kickl, I think he will be the next Chancellor. He's another Orban-type figure.
So Europe will be divided.
Europe will be very divided. The question is, where would Germany and France go? Because
I was about to. The last question for me would be: tell us a bit more. How do you see this very important, if not, kind of quintessential relationship between France and Germany in the European integration project? I mean,
assuming that Merz gets elected, and he'll be in office, say, in April or May. That would be a realistic assumption. Then he would have 2 years in which he would work together with Macron. That would be Macron's final 2 years. And the question is, Merz is more European. On the other hand, Merz's Europeanness is very much a German Europeanness. Like the Euro is the Europe that I own, the Europe that I run, the Europe that works the way I want it to work. Mm-hmm. And this is not going to be so easy to do with Macron. who actually thinks about Europe in exactly the same way.
But from a French perspective.
From a French perspective. So there will be very big egos coming together here. And it may work. It may work that they may find that they may see with Trump, it's actually better if they work together. So I'm keeping an open mind. So I'm not totally negative about this. I'm not predicting. My book doesn't do policy, by the way. I said, I wrote enough to actually explain what happened, explain the dynamism about it. The policy would take a book of the same size. It's really complicated. I wouldn't start from here. That would be my first policy response. Having gotten into this mess, it's not an easy way to get out of it. I don't have easy answers to this either. But yes, it could happen. You need majorities in politics to do this. And the majorities you don't need to do what Millet did or what Musk did. That's not the first thing. The first thing you need to do is the solution, in my view, can only be European.
That's where we agree, yes.
There cannot be a German solution to this problem. So a European solution will require a fiscal union and a capital markets union. And I can say, and I think we have to be, as pro-Europeans, we have to be loud about this. I've had a lot of friends during the global financial crisis who were all talking about fiscal union, and so they stopped talking about this. They're telling me, it's not realistic, the Merkel doesn't like it, and the CDU doesn't want it. So we have to make compromises. And that's where the whole thing derailed. And I think we have to basically say, the recovery fund is not a replacement for a Eurobond, because it is an intra-governmental transfer. Germans paying money to Italy and Spain. That's what it was.
The next generation you mean?
Yeah, the whole thing. This is not a fiscal. What you need, a federal system, in a federal system, you don't transfer from country to country. You may calculate that there is sort of, but it's not. You assume. In the German federal or the U.S. federal system, you could calculate that New York transfers money to Texas. But it's not the state of New York that transfers any money to the state of Texas. It is just that there may be richer tax income payers in New York than there are in Texas, and then that goes through the redistributive mechanisms. We
had today an honoris causa for Borrell at the Comillas University here in Madrid, and he actually recalled the Hamilton moment. And he said it was only half of the Hamilton moment, because Hamilton, yes, kind of, issued debt, joint debt, but he as well introduced taxes for the first time. A lot of people forget that Hamilton did both. It was not only the issuance, you need as well this capacity as well to collect taxes. And we don't move in that direction.
Depends on the kindness of its member states, because it's EU budget contributions. That might change in the future. So, of course, it was not a Hamilton moment. I wrote heavily against the use of the word Hamilton moment. I don't think we Europeans should use these American expressions, because it's not how we work. Our EU is not the United States. This is not a Hamiltonian movement. I am in favor of a fiscal union, capital markets union, but I don't care about Hamilton. This has nothing to do with what we're doing. It's a very different circumstances, and the structure would be very different. But yes, the EU would need, if it has debt-raising rights, debt issuance capacity, it will need tax-raising powers. That's what makes a sovereign bond a sovereign bond.
Exactly.
That the institution can, or the government can raise the taxes in order to pay off the bondholders. That's why sovereign. That's why there were a lot of, including economists, who were shocked to discover that EU debt traded at a discount to German and French debt. The yields were significantly higher. Mm-hmm. Because they hadn't realized that the markets, bond traders, look at sovereign debt and EU debt very differently. A sovereign debt is really much, for them, a sovereign bond is very much related to the sovereignty of a state. That makes it sovereign. It's not the fact that it is a government issue bond. And the EU thing was essentially a CDO. It was a structured product. Bit like, not as bad as the ones from the global financial crisis, but it was a structured product. It was difficult to understand. If you don't understand EU law, there's no chance of you understanding the financial structure of this thing. And people said, rightly so, no, this is not a European bond. This is a collection of national debt certificates, and whether we get our money back or not depends very much on whether all of the countries want to pay and agree to fund the EU in the future.
Wolfgang, it was a truth pleasure to have you here, to have this conversation. Thanks for the questions. And I think we should thank Wolfgang in the usual way. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Miguel.